Hey there, how's it going? Welcome back to a new video. Today I want to talk a little bit about commands. The command is, I think, a deeply misunderstood pattern. It's way simpler than it sounds, or at least way simpler than most people think, and turns out you might be already using it without knowing. So on this first video, we're going to look into commands, and in the next video, we're going to look into command buses. I'm pretty sure you've heard about commands or the command bus, and I hope this video clarifies it for you. With that said, let's jump into the code. All right, let's take a look at some example code that I have here. I have a very simple controller that simply stores a post. I also have a test, and let's test it. It's passing. We post some JSON, we fetch a post, and then we make sure that we have the expected values. All right, this is pretty simple, but it's for educational purposes. Imagine that in a real application, you might want to associate an author with a post. You might check if that author can post that, etc., etc., etc. So just imagine we have way more complex logic here. Before we talk about commands, let's talk about actions, which is a popular pattern in the Laravel community. Many times what you're going to see is that people are going to create an actions directory and store actions here. For example, an action might be a store post. And then that action would have a handle method that expects a title, some content, and maybe a publish date. And it could return a post as well. And then you would extract this and instead call this action right here. And here you could do something like post. You want to create a post, pass the title, pass the content, and then the publish date, like this. Now, on your controller, you're going to remove business logic, and instead what you would do is, for example, you could inject the store post action, let's call it action, and then we would simply call the action, call the handle method, pass whatever we need, and get rid of this. Let's rerun our tests. They're failing. Yeah, we're passing the string, so let's refactor this and pass something more meaningful to the action. We can use the date method from the request object and say published at. Okay, cool. Now it's passing. Sometimes people will also just pass the entire request object to the action, and that way you moved code from the controller into an action which is meant to handle business logic. The reason I wanted to talk about actions first is because actions are pretty much self-handling commands. A command represents intent. So something that your application is supposed to handle. For example, our command could be store post as well. And then we would pass arguments to it, the content as well, and then the publish date, just like we did with the action. All right, now you might be thinking, okay, what's the difference? I'm not following. Well, the difference is commands are simply DTOs. They only contain data. They do not contain behavior. And they're meant to be an envelope that you can pass to a handler. So think about a controller that receives a lot of arguments in a request, or whatever class you have in your application that just passes a lot of arguments. In this case, we only have 3. But what if we had, 15 arguments or 10 arguments? This would get huge. Every time that we needed to make a change, we would need to add a new argument to the action, update the controller, etc. A command simply represents intent, and our intent here is to restore a post, and this is the information we need to restore a post. So let's make the change here. Let's get rid of this. I'm actually going to copy this into my clipboard, and then we can get rid of this. We can make this class read only, and then let's add a constructor. So we expect a title, we expect a content, and we also expect a publish date, like this. Okay, so we have this command and we can get rid of this. Let's move this from actions to, let me create a directory called commands. There we go. And the problem here is that this is just an object. It only contains data. It doesn't really do anything. So commands also have handlers, and that's why I said that actions are pretty much self-handling commands. For each command that we create, we must also create a handler. So let's create a store post handler, which receives a command as an argument. So we expect a store post here, and let's fix indentation. There we go. And now we can simply instantiate the handler, pass the command, and then we can call the handle method on the handler. And on the handle method, we're going to do what we were doing. So let me update this. We need to import this, and this becomes a property on the command. This also becomes a property. And this also becomes a property of the command. We can type hint this, so it's return a post, And then if we rerun a task, well, it's not passing. Let's see what happened. Unresolvable dependency. Let's see what happened. All right, we have this type hinted. So let's get rid of this. Laravel container was trying to inject store posts, but it has properties and they need to be filled. So let's rerun this. Okay, now we're back to green. That's pretty much what commands are. The difference between a command and an action is that an action is self-handling while a command is not. A command requires a handler. In fact, you can think of a command just as a very simple data transfer object that is used by a handler. So think of this as an envelope where you can pass data and pass intent, and that gets passed into a handler. And you might be thinking, isn't this overkill? Sometimes it is. Sometimes an action is fine and that solves your needs. However, when you have more complex logic and you have different dependencies, a lot of data, a command also often makes sense. Now, there's also a fundamental difference between actions and commands. Commands are not only this. You're not going to instantiate a command, instantiate the handler, and call the handler. You're usually going to use a command bus. And a command bus allows you to add a lot of functionality on top of your commands. And we're going to take a look into that on the next lesson. So try not to think about this as a simple alternative to actions, because they're not. A command with a command bus allows you to add a lot more functionality, things that you wouldn't be able to do with actions, at least not if you're injecting the action into your controller or whatever class you have. All right, this is pretty much all commands too. On the next lesson, we're going to take a look into command buses and see how we can extend functionality and when does it make sense to use one. Thanks for watching, and I see you in the next video.